Hello everyone, welcome to the third installment of our High Elevation 5 Needle White Pines 2025-2026 Science and Management webinar series, and also the first installment of the co-hosted webinar with the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. I'm Enzo Martelli Moya, a PhD student in Karen Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and I'm co-organizing this webinar with Karina Lee, a master's student in Diana Tombach's Forest Ecology Lab at the University of Colorado, Denver, and also Lou Deloisy, a PhD student in Daniel Ulrich's lab at Montana State University. We have another great presentation for today, and I'd like to start by introducing our board member, Executive Director Julie Shamhart, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Enzo, and thanks everyone for being here today. I just wanted to give a quick update from the foundation on some ways you could get involved in the foundation if you're interested. We could certainly use everyone's help. We have a new project that we are partnering with Adventurous Scientists. This is another nonprofit out of Bozeman. And that project is tracking whitebark pine in Washington and Oregon. And there's going to be a webinar. It's coming up the first week of December. So if you're interested in learning how you can get involved in citizen science, collecting data on whitebark pine in Washington and Oregon, I'm going to drop a link in the chat box here in a minute, and you can learn more about that project. And yeah, if you're going to be in Washington or Oregon over the holidays or anytime, if you live there, great. It would be great to get your help collecting some data. And while I'm on that, the Tracking Whitebark Pine project is organized by our education committee. And just wanted to put a plug in for anyone who is interested in getting involved in our education committee. We're looking for members outside of Montana. We have a great group of members in Montana, and we're looking for anyone else within the whitebark pine range who would like to get involved in our education committee and do great things like plan projects, these citizen science projects, and a lot of other great ways to get involved. And you get to work with folks like Enzo, who is both on our webinar planning group and our education committee. So you can reach out to me if you're interested in getting involved, and I will drop that information in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Julie. If you miss any of our previous installments, you can find the recordings to the talks on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks. The link to our website will be posted in the chat in a second. Also, check out the Northern Rockies Fire Center Network webinar series, where they explore research, tools, and solutions for fire-adapted forest ecosystems across the Northern Rockies. The link to their website will be posted in the chat as well in a few seconds. Finally, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments, doubts, and questions, and please post them on the chat box, and our team will be collecting them throughout. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Josh Beisel. Josh is a PhD candidate at the University of Montana, and his work centers on tree-to-tree interactions, climate change impacts on forest ecosystems, and the ecology of whitebark pine. His path in forest research has taken him deep into the high elevation landscapes of the Northern Rockies, where he studies how changing fire regimes and shifting climate conditions shape regeneration patterns in subalpine forest. His current project, conducted in collaboration with the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network and partially supported by the Joint Fire Science Program, examines how elevation, fire history, and lock-and-stand conditions influence natural whitebark pine recruitment across treeline ecotone in the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness. Through this work, Josh aims to improve our understanding of how whitebark pine may respond to future climate and fire conditions, and to support manager strategies that help sustain these keystone species across its range. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh. Welcome around.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Enzo. Couldn't have said any better. But yeah, my name's Josh. And yeah, I think Enzo gave a pretty good kind of overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Before I start, I just want to give a nod to my collaborators on this project and the different organizations that have helped fund it and make it possible. I'll kind of go into those in a little more detail at the end here. But jumping right into it, let's see if I can. Okay, there we go. So yeah, jumping right into it. So just to kind of give us some context about the environment I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to use the term high elevation forest systems or high elevation forest quite a bit throughout this talk. And so I just want to make sure I'm kind of clear about my definition there and the characteristics that go along with it. So When I talk about high elevation forests, I'm describing this entire zone from kind of the upper limit of closed canopy subalpine forest all the way up through this sort of parkland transitional environment that we can see in the image in the background here, all the way up to tree line. And so above tree line, right, we get into the alpine environment where we don't see trees growing anymore. And these environments are generally energy limited. So they're wet, they're cold, there's snow on the ground for a lot of the season, and there's relatively short growing seasons. So trees grow really slowly in these environments, and on sort of biological time scales, things happen quite slowly. And these zones are really particularly sensitive to impacts of global change. We think about high latitude and high altitude environments of kind of being the first things to bear the brunt of these global change impacts. And so when it comes to regeneration dynamics in these high elevation forests, right, this figure shows the kind of nice sort of bottleneck effect that occurs in these forest systems. So kind of in general, across all forest systems, these sort of dispersal limitations, germination limitations, and establishment limitations exist. So you have to have a seed source. You have to have a way for the seeds to get there. So whether that's wind or in the case of whitebark pine, birds with the Clark's nutcracker, you have to have the conditions for germination to occur. So there has to be an adequate substrate, water, the right temperatures, et cetera. And then after trees germinate, they actually have to be able to kind of survive in that site where they're growing and eventually recruit into adult size classes. And so in these high elevation forest environments, these kind of last two steps of establishment and growth, it's a lot harder place to be a tree, right? It's cold, it's windy, the growing season is short. And so there's kind of a much higher constraint on trees at these stages in these high elevation environments. And then when it comes to fire regimes in high elevation forests, generally these forests follow or are sort of under high severity, low frequency regimes. So as I mentioned, they're cold, they're wet. The conditions for which fire can occur only line up every so often, at least historically. And fire spread and fire effects in these areas are relatively heterogeneous due to complex topography and fuel connectivity. So unfortunately, I didn't have an image from the bitter root of an active fire. I borrowed this one from the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. But it kind of describes the sort of topography that we conducted this study in, right? Where you have these valley bottoms with continuous forest cover, and then moving up these ridge lines, you have talus fields, cliffs, meadows. You get up towards the ridge line, and tree cover becomes pretty sparse. And so the way that fire burns through these environments is quite different than, sort of your like mid-montane closed canopy forest. And the other piece of this that's always really fascinated me is that fires can burn through these significant environmental gradients. So, kind of in this example, right, the trees that are growing in this valley bottom versus the trees that are growing up on this exposed ridge are experiencing very different environmental conditions, but they can burn in a single fire event. And those post-fire conditions are going to be quite different, despite the fact that they burn at the same time and geographically they're not that far away from one another. And then kind of taking a step back and just looking at the bigger picture of kind of what we know is happening in these forests, especially in the Western US, there's a lot of cool work that has been done where we can see that, the average sort of elevation at which fire is burning is increasing in most regions throughout the Western US. And the proportion of area burned in these subalpine parkland high elevation environments is increasing in step with the rest of the region. So that figure on the right there is showing total proportion of area burned across all forest types in that dark blue line. And you can see that the subalpine parkland and the alpine are sort of increasing it proportionally with those other forest types. So these forests, despite being high elevation and cold and wet, are not immune from these changes being brought on by shifting climates. And then when we think about tree establishment patterns changing as a direct effect of climate, so kind of setting fire aside for a second and just focusing on direct effects of climate change. This is a study that was done in sort of central Montana, looking at sites on either side of the Continental Divide. And essentially what they're showing is that not only is the sort of maximum elevation at which trees are growing is increasing, but the density of trees in that sort of transitional parkland zone, so that ATL and BTL is above tree line and below tree line. So that kind of transitional zone, the density of trees growing in those areas have increased since sort of, the mid to early 1900s. So we're seeing this tree line advance and possible densification in these forests, so shifting establishment patterns due to warming climate, making things kind of easier to be a tree, for lack of a better term. And so this kind of brings these sort of questions of, okay, well, what are going to be the interactive effects, right? We expect climate to basically essentially make it easier for trees to establish sort of around and above tree line. But potentially, if we're increasing area burned or proportion of area burned in these forests, right, they take a really long time to grow back relative to other forest types. So we might kind of think that fire would have the opposite effect. But when it comes to interactive effects between the two, there's still sort of a lot to be figured out. And sort of part of what I'm interested in here is trying to kind of tease apart how different species might respond to these interactive effects. And so when it comes to the species of our high elevation forests here in the Northern Rockies, we have these kind of 4 major species that compromise our high elevation forests. So whitebark pine, of course, is going to be a familiar one to this audience. Subalpine larch, also another really cool species that we find in these forests. And then subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce as well. And so when I think about kind of how these forests are made up, I tend to kind of lump these 4 species into 2 groups, kind of how I have them laid out here. So whitebark pine and subalpine larch tend to be our early successional species because they're shade intolerant, but they're stress tolerant. So they're good at growing in these kind of open, harsh, windy, snowy, cold environments. And they like to be in sort of direct sunlight. They don't do as well in general, sort of under the canopies of other trees. On the other hand, we have subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, which are less stress tolerant, right? But they're relatively shade tolerant and tolerant of competition. So they're pretty good at sort of kind of growing up underneath other trees and surviving in the understory for long periods of time. And so, obviously that's sort of a simplified model of how forest succession occurs. But in general, that does kind of hold. And then, of course, the whitebark pine is kind of the star of the show because not in addition to just being a very cool species, having all these, important ecological roles, right, it's facing significant threats across its distribution. And so this piece probably won't be news to this audience, but whitebark pine is a keystone species in the high elevation forest throughout Western North America. But it's facing these precipitous population declines due to blister rust, white pine blister rust, invasive fungal pathogen, mountain pine beetle, direct effects of climate change, and then these sort of indirect effects on shifting fire regimes. And so there's already a lot of great work being done. A lot of folks, the organizers of this webinar and a lot of folks in the audience, I'm sure, are working hard to conserve and restore the species, right? But this is not an easy species to work with because it grows in these really rugged, high elevation environments. A lot of whitebark pine distribution is within wilderness, so there's these added sort of regulation barriers. And things like planting rust-resistant seedlings are really complex and expensive. It requires a lot of work to get a 2-year-old rust-resistant seedling ready to go, not even accounting for getting it out and on the landscape. And so really what I'm hoping to do is sort of add to our knowledge about whitebark pine to ensure that, we can maximize our limited resources for these efforts. And so when we think about whitebark pine regeneration specifically, right, a lot of times we think about whitebark pine playing this post-fire colonizer role where, Clark's nutcrackers are able to disperse whitebark pine seeds out into these big high severity patches where other tree seeds aren't going to get. They do really well in these open, harsh environments, and they sort of kick off forest succession in these high elevation post-fire forests. But, in the last decade, we've really come to realize that they can only play this role when there's healthy seed sources in relatively close proximity. And then we also know that whitebark pine is relatively successful on these dry, exposed, stressful sites relative to its co-occurring species. But there's some variation in the topographic niche kind of from zone to zone within its range. So that's something that we can kind of do a better job, hopefully, constraining and quantifying. And then despite its sort of overall tolerance to environmental stress, whitebark pine is still sensitive to changing climatic conditions, especially at its lower elevational trailing edge. And so really cool paper that came out a couple months ago by Sean Parks and others, looking at sort of bioclimatic niche of whitebark pine and how that's expected to change in the future. I definitely recommend folks check that out. And I'll kind of circle back to that when I talk about what our results, the bearing that our results have on whitebark pine at the end here. And so that brings me to my research questions. So really kind of what the questions were that guided this analysis. The first overall question is, how do fire occurrence and site conditions influence high elevation forest seedling and sapling communities? So it's kind of using our entire data set to try to help quantify what's driving abundance of these different species at these different sites. Question 2 is kind of zooming in on the fire component and seeing, does fire severity, time since fire, or post-fire climate affect regeneration within these burn stands? And then finally, what are the implications of these dynamics for the management of whitebark pine? So I'm going to kind of start off going through question 1 and question 2, share my results there, sort of sum up what we found, and then I'll end the talk with a really kind of laser focus on whitebark pine and the implications for management. So before I get into the results, I'm going to go over real quick how we did this and how we kind of carried out this analysis. So here's a map of our sites kind of sprinkled along the Bitterroot Crest in the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness on the Idaho-Montana border there. And so we sampled 10 high elevation forest sites across the Bitterroot Mountains. We spent 43 days in the wilderness, not consecutively, but broken up across the field season. We hiked over 120 miles and climbed over 70,000 feet of elevation. And I just like to mention those stats because I just want to give a nod to, how much effort went into collecting this data. I mean, amazing to get to spend that much time in these environments, but definitely, it was not roadside science. These were some big long days to be able to walk away with this data set. And we sampled fires that occurred between 1979 and 1998, which is a little bit older, longer back in time than most kind of post-fire regeneration studies, and I'll explain why that is in a second. But at each one of these sites, we sampled within the burn and outside of the burn at 2 elevational positions to try to kind of capture this environmental gradient. And so here you can see what one of those sites looked like. So this is a satellite image. I'm sorry, I think it's actually an aerial image of one of our sites near Gash Point, Montana, which if anyone backcountry skis in the Bitterroot Range, they're probably familiar with that zone. But you can see our kind of 2x2 factorial design here, where we sampled kind of up near treeline and then down near this sort of interface between closed canopy subalpine forest and sort of the parkland treeline, ecotone transition. And at each one of those transects, we walked a line. We sampled sort of systematically at equally spaced intervals along that line. And then we went out and we found the largest mature trees over 20 centimeters at breast height and sampled plots around those trees. And so I haven't mentioned this up to this point, but so the analysis I'm talking about today is sort of a value added component of another study. The original study, we were actually coring all these trees and we were looking at pre and post fire growth responses. What I'm going to be talking about today is specifically focused on sort of the juvenile counts that we took within these plots. So kind of using what was originally sort of a predictor variable to describe forest structure in the original study and using that as our response. And then you can see here we kind of had these inset fixed radius plots where we sampled juveniles and ground cover in this interior 3-meter plot. And then that entire 6-meter circular plot, we classified overstory forest structure. So we counted trees, we binned them into size classes, and we identified them by species and counted live and dead. And so here's one more look, same site up at Gash Point, but from the ground level. So these are pictures that were taken at plot centers along those transect lines in each one of our factorial treatments or sort of, and so, you can see there's pretty significant differences between sort of the size of trees, the density of trees, obviously much lower stem density in those burns. But you can also see how we have kind of smaller, tightly spaced trees at the upper elevation transects and then sort of larger, more evenly spaced trees at those lower elevation unburned transects. Okay, so as far as analysis goes, so we walked out from that field campaign with a bunch of data. And in this case, what we're using from that data set is we're using our juvenile counts by species. So that's stems less than 8 centimeters at breast height in that interior 3-meter fixed radius plot. That's our response. That's what we're trying to model. And then we have our field level predictors. So that's overstory composition, so species size and status, alive or dead, for all of our overstory trees, and then ground cover. So we estimated ocular ground cover. So that's biotic and abiotic, which is, oh boy, what's my computer doing? There we go. And so we also went out and we accessed a bunch of geospatial data from different sources to sort of help complement our field data. So we used a 10-meter USGS digital elevation model to extract elevation, slope aspect, heat load index, which is basically a measure of like solar radiation. So southern aspects being higher, northern aspects being lower. Topographic wetness index, which is essentially like how much area drains into a given site and how much kind of do we expect water to collect there. Burn severity metrics, satellite-derived burn severity from Parks and others, Selway-Bitterroot Fire Atlas. And we also access post-fire climate data from the PRISM 4-kilometer gridded climate product. And so we have our field data predictors, our geospatial predictors that were extracted from GPS points for each of our sites. We have our response, and then we use generalized linear mixed models to fit our to fit our response to our predictors. And the reason that we took this approach is count data, and our count data is generally not normally distributed. And so a sort of run-of-the-mill linear modeling approach doesn't quite work there. And then we also have this hierarchical data set where we have plots within sites. And so the mixed model approach allows us to account for basically variation within sites and variation among sites and sort of bake that into our estimates. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and present some of the results. So question one, kind of starting with these big picture fire occurrence and site condition questions or variables. So this is one way to visualize the outputs of those generalized linear mixed models. And before I really dive into it, I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what we're looking at here and how to interpret it. So essentially what this is a coefficient plot, which is showing us so each species is represented by a color and a shape. So those are individual species models. And then all the predictors that went into these models were centered and scaled. So basically they're standardized. And what that allows us to do is really easily compare sort of proportional changes between the different models. And so how we can interpret these plots is if we find a species and a shape and we follow it down to the x-axis is showing us the proportional change that the model expects with a 1 standard deviation increase in the predictor. So using elevation and whitebark pine as an example here, you find that whitebark pine kind of red diamond. And what that is telling us is that the model predicts, after sort of accounting for everything else, a 1 standard deviation increase in elevation. So based on kind of the distribution of elevations that we sampled, is associated with a 2.8 times increase in abundance of whitebark pine juveniles. And then those black lines are basically our confidence intervals. So that tells us sort of the uncertainty regarding those estimates. And if those black lines overlap with that 1.0 line, like the one for Engelmann spruce does here, what that's basically telling us is there's a lot of uncertainty regarding that estimate, and there's a decent chance that sort of the actual value could be 1.0, and the proportional change of 1.0 is basically no change. So we can think about things that are on or really, largely overlapping with that 1.0 line are sort of, we're not so sure about the estimate there, and there could kind of be no clear effect. Okay, so I'm going to kind of try to walk through these pieces one by one here. And so these were kind of our major fire and topography variables that we forced every model to include these variables so that we could at least compare these across species. And so looking at our just categorical burned, unburned, what's kind of surprising is we don't see a clear effect of fire. So, in general, we actually see a somewhat negative effect for whitebark pine and fir, and we see a somewhat positive effect for spruce and larch. However, as we can see, those confidence intervals overlap with 1 in sometimes, in a pretty meaningful way. And so, we're not super confident about sort of the accuracy of those estimates. Elevation, however, we see this pretty clear effect pop out where it's relatively neutral to slightly negative for spruce and fir. But for whitebark and larch, we see this strong positive influence of elevation on juvenile abundance. And so kind of what that's telling us is we're not finding very many whitebark and larch seedlings and saplings at that lower elevational band, even though that lower elevational band is relatively high and within definitely the range of where, historically we would expect to find these species. So we can't say definitively, but that essentially sort of hints at the fact that there might be this sort of upward elevational shift occurring for these two species. Moving on to heat load index. So like I mentioned earlier, this is like a measurement of sort of solar radiation. So 1.0 would be a really steep south-facing aspect. 0.0 would be like a very flat north-facing aspect, or almost perfectly flat. So kind of think of from cooler, wetter to hotter, drier. And so what's interesting here is we kind of see whitebark pine sort of separated out from all the other species. So spruce, larch, and fir are all negatively associated with increasing heat load index. They prefer, or they're more abundant in these sort of wetter, cooler areas. Whereas whitebark pine kind of falls out with a slightly positive relationship with heat load index, although obviously there's some uncertainty regarding that estimate. And then looking at topographic wetness index. So again, this is sort of a measurement of like how much area is draining into a site and kind of how wet do we expect that site to be based on that sort of hydrological metric. And what we see is that spruce tends to be more abundant in these sort of wetter areas, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, when we're out on these landscapes, we tend to see large Engelmann spruce growing in these little hollows and draws in places where there's a little more water and the soil is a little deeper. All the other species are sort of slightly negatively associated with this variable, but as with heat load index, there's some sort of uncertainty there, and those confidence bands overlap 1. And then lastly, looking at just slope angle, we see that all species except for whitebark pine have a pretty strong negative association with slope angle, so we don't see as many of them on steeper slopes. But whitebark pine is relatively neutral, and so that kind of suggests that whitebark pine is able to regenerate on a sort of wider array of slope angles, including steeper ones, whereas those other species, not so much. And then getting into some, we found some interesting sort of interactive effects between some of our different variables. And so this is looking at overstory structure, con-specific, density specifically. So in each of these graphs, we're looking at elevation on the x-axis, either subalpine fir juveniles or whitebark pine juveniles on the y-axis. And these different color bands represent sort of the mean values for varying densities of overstory conspecific. So same species, but adults in the overstory. And so we see this kind of inverse relationship between subalpine fir and whitebark pines. For subalpine fir, in these sort of lower elevational bands, there's not much of a difference whether there's 884 adult subalpine firs per hectare or 177. But as we increase in elevation, there's this positive association with overstory adult density. As far as with whitebark pine, we see almost the opposite. So at these lower elevational bands, we predict greater whitebark pine juveniles when there's lots of adult whitebark pine. And then as we increase in elevation, those estimates kind of converge, and then the influence of adult whitebark pine is somewhat diminished. And so this could be due to a variety of factors. Potentially with subalpine fir, there's a sort of seed source component where down here at the lower elevations, right, there's plenty of subalpine fir, forest cover is relatively continuous. There's plenty of subalpine fir seed to go around. And so it doesn't really matter what that sort of small scale neighborhood looks like. But as we increase in elevation, forest cover becomes more patchy, the seeds are wind dispersed. We might, kind of associate that with, okay, there's more adult overstory in this cluster, there's going to be more juveniles right underneath them. Potentially, there's also sort of a stress like facilitation component here where up at these high elevation sites, the juvenile subalpine fir are doing better in these dense neighborhoods where there's a bunch of overstory adults kind of buffering them from wind and snow and cold. Whitebark pine, on the other hand, the seed source limitation or dispersal limitation piece is probably not as relevant, obviously, because their seeds are dispersed by nutcrackers. However, there has been some evidence that nutcrackers will cache seeds under mature overstory, so that could kind of muddle that a little bit. But likely what we think is going on here, right, is at these lower elevational positions where potentially the sort of climate is becoming unfavorable to whitebark pine regeneration, where you have dense, lots of adult whitebark pine that are doing well, right? If it's good to be an adult down here still, it's probably also a good place to be a juvenile. As we increase in elevation, that effect kind of goes away because now we're moving into kind of this core zone where the climate is right for whitebark pine. Moving along to ground cover variables. So everything we found here kind of fits with kind of what we'd expect. So we see bare mineral soil has a positive effect on these early seral species, whitebark and larch, that prefer or kind of need bare mineral soil to germinate. Sort of an interesting outcome here that wasn't necessarily expected is that fir seems to be the most sensitive to understory plant competition. So it's sort of this very small magnitude effect, right? But generally we see less subalpine fir juveniles when there's lots of shrub cover, lots of grass cover, and lots of forb cover. That sort of high, greater than a meter tall shrub sort of being the most highly negative. The other piece of this that I just think is kind of interesting, but kind of cool and is kind of a good gut check of like, hey, our statistics and this sort of sampling of the landscape sort of reflects what we know about the system and what we see is if we look at sort of the combination of factors that are positively associated with subalpine larch abundance, juvenile abundance, it really does a pretty good job characterizing the sort of typical stands that we see in the Bitterroot Mountains. So this was taken actually this fall, but I think it does a really good job illustrating this point. is that in these pure larch stands in the Bitterroot Mountains, we kind of see this sort of, combination of, they're relatively rocky, but then we have these sort of shelves where we have a combination of grass, grominoid grasses, forbs, and rock cover. And then we have these little pockets of bare mineral soil, and that's where we're seeing larch regenerate. So I don't know, it's kind of cool to be able to relate sort of the statistical kind of piece of this back to the landscape and see that it makes sense. Okay, so moving along into the sort of fire specific stuff. So for this analysis, the first few things I'm going to present, for all of this, we just looked at our burn plots. And for the severity piece specifically, we were just looking at plots that burned after 1984 because we weren't able to get reliable satellite-derived burn severity for the pre-1984 plots. But so looking at all burned plots and looking at time since fire. So time since fire only showed up as an important variable for whitebark and fir, which is why we don't see spruce and larch here. But interestingly, we found that there's a negative association between whitebark pine juvenile density and years since fire. So as you can see here, right, there's a reduction in the expected abundance of whitebark pine juveniles with increasing years since fire. And so we think there's maybe a couple of reasons why that is. Potentially a piece here that sort of fits with what we know about whitebark pine, right, is there was more time at these sites, unfortunately, for whitebark or white pine blister rust to sort of take hold and cause mortality. So seedlings, saplings that germinated and established right in the wake of these earlier kind of late 1970 fire events probably had more exposure to rust, higher chance of those died of rust between the time that they germinated and the time that we sampled these sites. So that could potentially be driving this effect. Also, in those older fires, so that kind of late 1970s period, where when we sampled, it was about 44 years post-fire, kind of right on the cusp of when potentially they could be recruiting into those adult size classes. So kind of back of the napkin growth estimates, 45 to 50 years for a whitebark pine seedling in these environments to reach 8 centimeters at breast height is like, it's possible. So there's potentially kind of two things going on there. And then as far as post-fire climate goes, so again, these variables only showed up as important for fir and whitebark pine, which is why I'm only showing those two species. And what we found was kind of cool is that whitebark pine was really the only one that was particularly sensitive to post-fire climate. And also just kind of a good gut check is that despite sort of a limited number of fire years to be able to compare post-fire climates across, the results that we show here fit quite nicely with what we kind of already, kind of know about whitebark pine and the other species at these elevations, right? So, increased growing season is a good thing. Water deficit is a bad thing. Winter precipitation and snowpack can kind of mediate those two things. So like the ideal sort of post-fire climate in these environments is, right, you want wet and lots of water, and you also want to maximize growing season. And that kind of creates the conditions that are best for these seedlings. Okay, and so now moving along to the severity piece. So we found some interesting interactions between fire severity and topography for subalpine fir and whitebark pine. And so this is looking just at subalpine fir. And the figure on the right there kind of shows what that variable topographic wetness index looks like on the landscape. So kind of blue values are these sort of basins, little concavities, hollows, whatever you want to call them, where water would tend to collect. And then red values are these sort of ridgeline, kind of open, warmer, things that drain and don't hold as much water. And so what we see is with increasing fire severity, we see increasing subalpine fir juvenile abundance, but really only in these wet spots. So actually we see a slightly negative effect on these sort of dry areas across burn severity. But it seems like subalpine fir actually does a pretty good job regenerating even after high severity fire, right? But again, these sites were sampled multiple decades after fire, so there was plenty of time for this to occur, but they're really only regenerating in those high severity sites when they are these sort of wetter, sort of more protected areas. Now for whitebark pine, we show almost the opposite thing. So whitebark pine is regenerating in high severity patches in these really harsh, open ridgeline topography environments. And then in these wetter environments, whitebark pine is actually doing slightly better in low severity. And so that also sort of fits with an understanding that we have about low severity fire potentially opening up sort of regeneration habitat for whitebark pine in these more mesic, more wet sites. But again, kind of cool to see sort of like these sort of how the different niches sort of separate out between whitebark pine and subalpine fir, and being able to characterize these kind of cool interactions between burn severity and topography. So not only does severity matter, but kind of where severity occurs relative to topography is also really important. Okay, so before I move on to the kind of final whitebark management piece, I just kind of want to wrap up our findings. That was a lot of information, I know. So kind of key takeaways here. So kind of answer to question one, looking at fire and site conditions, right? So what we found is that regeneration is more tied to species niche and topographic variables than fire occurrence. So really that's those sort of small scale site level conditions explain, quite a bit of the variability in juvenile abundance. And just because something burned or didn't burn doesn't actually do that good of a job describing that seedling and sapling community. So one kind of good piece of that is what that kind of tells us is that, fire is not like causing some huge shift in the seedling and sapling community at these sites. Zooming in on the fire effects, so what we found is that the effect of immediate post-fire climate may be limited on multi-decadal scales. So we didn't see anything for larch and spruce. We saw this very limited sort of uncertain effect for fir, but there might be a lasting effect for whitebark pine. And that sort of fits with our kind of previous understandings of post-fire climate effects on whitebark pine. And when it comes to fire severity, right? Fire severity, the importance of fire severity is mediated by topography for whitebark pine and fir. So there's these important sort of interactive effects. Just because it burned at high severity doesn't necessarily tell us what kind of seedling and sapling community we're going to see. We also have to consider sort of the topography where that fire occurred. And so tying these sort of conclusions back to these big ecological questions that I teased in the introduction, right? Is there evidence for major changes in regeneration patterns in the Bitterroot Mountains at these high elevation sites? In general, not really. So we're not really seeing these like huge shifts. We're not seeing huge differences between burned and unburned stands. But kind of, I think the major sort of change or sort of, like potential change that we're seeing is this upward elevational shift in whitebark pine and subalpine larch. We're not finding very many whitebark pine or larch seedlings in this sort of lower elevational band that we sampled, despite it being within kind of the species zone or contemporary zone. And then this kind of, is fire inciting or accelerating changes in high elevation seedling sapling communities? We don't see any clear fire associated shifts. But I want to emphasize that, this is just within the context of this study, right? Which is relatively high elevation sites kind of in this parkland ecotone environment that burned once in the late 1900s. And so that, I think kind of one of my takeaways from our findings here is like, hey, the sky's not falling. We're seeing regeneration. We're seeing sort of similar levels and compositions across these different burns. But, right, this might not extend to lower elevational subalpine forest. There's been some interesting work done on lower elevation subalpine forest that is burned multiple times. So sort of like short interval reburns in these, historically high severity, low frequency regimes. Can't really extend these findings to those kind of more extreme conditions. But in this sort of like business as usual case, good to know that things aren't changing dramatically. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here with kind of taking what we learned from these sort of species level and kind of across our study models and trying to apply that to whitebark pine management and using some geospatial analysis tools to basically kind of make that relevant within a management context. So what we did here is we sort of took those general relationships for whitebark pine regarding topography and overstory composition, and we refit models using data that we could sort of extend across the whole Bitterroot range. So that was really easy for the topographic variables. We have that for the whole area. But for the sort of overstory composition data, we use Forest Service inventory and analysis big map raster data sets. So these are estimates of above ground biomass by species across the continental US, super cool data set. And so we kind of plugged those variables in for, kind of sub those out for our field level measurements of overstory composition. We refit the models, which you can see kind of the code aspect of that there on the side. And so those models are associating a change in the predictor variable to a change in whitebark pine abundance at our sites. And then what we do is we use a big raster for the whole kind of Selway-Bitterroot, greater Selway-Bitterroot zone. We ask the model, we input the model with raster cell level predictions values of our predictor variables, and then the model predicts whitebark pine abundance for each of those cells, and it spits out something that looks like this, which are 10 meter pixels with predicted whitebark pine juvenile abundance per hectare. And so if we look at this kind of across this whole zone, so the majority of the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness, kind of part of the Great Burn Zone, kind of up there in the top left corner, you can see the wilderness boundary there in green. And so the way that these predictions were binned is partially we sort of use the distribution of the predictions. So these lower two classes are kind of the first two quartiles of the predictions. So 25% of the area predicted where some whitebark pine was, at least one whitebark pine seedling or sapling was predicted to be. And then that's 1 to 35, 35 to 100, the mean and the median are around 100. And then these higher elevation, higher abundance groups were sort of picked based on these sort of pulled some numbers from the literature to try to kind of understand these different potential scenarios of like, if you have that many seedlings and saplings on the landscape, is that enough to sort of perpetuate a population after accounting for mortality sort of in that intermediate time step? And so that 275 cutoff was a lower planting threshold used by Bob Keane in a paper, Bob Keane and others in 2017. And then that sort of 600-ish cutoff was used in a paper by Jenkins and others in 2022, looking at sort of restoration planning in the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. And so for folks that are familiar with the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan, right, we're going to see there was a data call which asked sort of regions and managers to submit geospatial data, basically polygons targeting like where the core areas for restoring whitebark pine are going to be in the future. And so we want to kind of see if we can build off that idea with our data here and really pinpoint where we expect to see the highest levels of whitebark pine juvenile abundance. And then obviously we can see from this kind of big scale picture, right, a lot of the area where we predict there to be whitebark pine juveniles is within the wilderness boundary. And without getting into like the weeds too much, right, there are added management barriers to sort of carrying out management actions in the wilderness. So we're kind of curious to see, okay, what proportion of these various sort of categories are within and without the wilderness area. And so I'm going to zoom in here on sort of the St. Mary Peak area so we can kind of see these things on a finer scale and kind of walk through this step by step. So just to kind of get us oriented here, this is the St. Mary Peak zone for folks that have been up there. The white line is the Forest Service road that takes you up to the trailhead, so it goes pretty high in elevation. The red dashed line is the trail up to the peak, and then the red triangle is the peak, and there's a fire lookout located up there. And that green kind of thicker line is the wilderness boundary. And so the reason I chose this area for this example is because it kind of has all these components. It has a lot of variation in elevation and aspects and things, so we can kind of get at that topographic piece. We have wilderness, non-wilderness, and it's sort of a realistic site for potential restoration activities because it's relatively accessible. Most of our field sites where we collected the data for this project were really difficult to get to. They're not places where even if you were able to, say, go plant there, regardless of wilderness bound or wilderness restrictions, right, it's going to be really, really difficult to get to those zones. So this is kind of a slightly more accessible place on the Bitterroot front. And so what we can see here, these are the Region 1 core areas for this zone. And so those are kind of outlined in black with that kind of light blue shading. And so these, this is a great tool. It does a good job kind of keying us in on where we might expect there to be whitebark pine and where restoration activity should take place, but it's still relatively coarse. And so kind of what we were wondering is, can we use our field data to kind of further constrain these zones? And so this is what our prediction raster looks like for this same zone. And so what we can see is, right, it seems like there's pretty good agreement between those two layers, but we can really see, one, this elevational effect, right, of these different bands of predicted abundance are really strongly tied to elevation. You can almost see the topo lines popping out there. So that's something that should really be considered. And then we can also see kind of these smaller sort of micro topography effects that are driving slight variation. And so this is kind of a lot to look at, but if we plot those things over one another, we do see that there's pretty good agreement between the core areas and what we predict from our field data. Some of those areas that are cut off at higher elevations, I forgot to mention this, but we basically restricted our predictions to the range of elevation, heat load index, etc., that we observed, as to try not to extrapolate too far away from our observation data. So that's why there's kind of like some missing zones. But especially the stuff at the lower elevations, right? We're not really expecting whitebark pine to be there anyways. And so what we show with our predictions here, right, is that there's potentially a smaller envelope for really the highest quality sites. These sites that we're expecting to have abundant natural regeneration are even slightly more restricted than the core area boundaries that we currently have. And then if we sort of mask out the wilderness areas and we just look at what we have outside of the wilderness, it depends on if you're a half glass full or a half glass empty person, right? Like there is a significant portion of that zone that is in the wilderness, which, maybe is going to be more difficult to implement actions in, but, there's still a reasonable amount outside. And in this case, right, it's about approximately 6% of the total area predicted in this extent falls in those kind of highest two abundance categories. And so, it's not a ton, but it's a reasonable amount where restoration activities could take place. And in this case specifically, right, kind of those highest quality sites seem to be right along that trail. So that even makes access easier. So kind of stepping back to sort of the big scale again, and then thinking about this sort of wilderness component. So we see that a lot of this does fall within the wilderness, and I got kind of curious, what actually is the proportion? And so if we take the proportion of all those, so total area, all the pixels where we predict at least one whitebark pine juvenile, we see that well over half of those areas are in wilderness, and a larger proportion of what is in wilderness is that really high quality habitat. What we're kind of left with here is about 1.6% of the predicted areas within this extent that fall within this outside of wilderness, but really, really high quality habitat. And so again, it depends on how you want to look at it. But I think that there are opportunities outside of the wilderness in the Bitterroot zone that are still really high quality sites and that could benefit from restoration actions. And so to kind of summarize all of that, the contemporary regeneration niche of whitebark pine in the Bitterroot Mountains tends to be in warmer, drier areas at higher elevations. Whitebark pine continues to sort of fill this post-fire colonizer role, but it's not restricted to that role. And so I think that our sort of the variability that we observe between burned and unburned sites kind of indicates to me that planting and restoration activities should prioritize biophysical site quality over disturbance history. So just because it burned doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a great place for whitebark pine. You have to really kind of zoom in on, do all the other pieces also tell us this is going to be a good place for whitebark pine? And is it going to be a good place, decades in the future? And lastly, kind of just want to note that, I think geospatial tools like the ones presented here can help further refine site selection for management actions and increase the probability of long-term restoration success. Cool. Well, that's all I have. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I want to acknowledge my co-authors and advisors on this project. I want to thank my field crew for helping me collect all this field data, the Selway-Bitterroot management team from the Bitterroot National Forest and the Nez Perce Clearwater for helping make this possible, and then also different funding sources from the Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Center, Joint Fire Sciences Program Graduate Research Innovation Award, and the University of Montana Wilderness Institute Meyer Graduate Fellowship, and then of course to Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and Northern Rockies Fire Science Network for hosting me today. Tons of information. Thanks everyone for going along for the ride, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was a really, really good talk. Now I would like to open the opportunity for our attendants to share your comments and questions. We have about 10 minutes left, and please type your question and comments into the chat. If we don't have enough time, we'll do as follows. We're going to send your questions to Josh with your contact information so you can follow up with him on your own time. And let's start with the first question coming from Laurel Sinwell. This is a very cool work. I completely second that comment. Why did you choose to use a standard deviation for your error bars? And if I'm not wrong, Laurel is referring to the first figure that you showed with the factors on the GLMM. And And the question particularly goes as, why did you choose to use error bars instead of confidence intervals? The latter allows you to assess statistical significance with respect to your tolerance for type 1 error.
Yes, that's a great question, and it actually clarifies. I think I might have misspoke a little bit when I was describing that. So essentially, the standard deviation component, I was referring specifically to the basically interpreting the standardized and scaled predictors, so that like the actual mean, or the estimates were proportional to a one standard deviation increase. The actual confidence, the error bars are actual 95% confidence intervals. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, so the model fitting process was using standardized predictors, which associate those proportional changes to a standard deviation in the predictor. But the bars around those estimates were actually confidence intervals from the model.
Great. Let's move to the next question. Amanda Hendricks asked, how were you defining adult whitebark pine trees?
Yes, that's a really good question. So for this study, we were basically, for all species, our cutoff was 20 centimeters at breast height. And I'm sure there could be a conversation about if that's a really, a good threshold or not. But generally, based on what we'd found in the literature about similar work and sort of what the cutoff was, and then also doing a kind of a pilot project at one of our sites, sampling a transect and kind of seeing what the size distribution was. That's kind of what we found as to be a reasonable sort of threshold for adult individuals.
Right. The next two questions, both from Glenda Scott and Diana Tombach, are related to one of your models showing probability of establishment for whitebark pine seedlings along an elevation gradient. I'm going to read Glenda's first. For the elevation effect with subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce at higher density in lower elevations, and whitebark pine and subalpine larch at spruce limit at higher, how much do you think the competition of subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce limits the whitebark pine and subalpine larch in that band?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think based on what we were seeing in these plots, right, like we didn't necessarily see that, if a fire burns in this lower elevational band, all of a sudden we see all this, these whitebark pine seedlings and saplings because that competition has been removed. That elevation effect was sort of across all plots. And so I guess that's why I sort of interpret it more as sort of a general elevational shift than sort of a competition mediated thing. But that being said, there totally could be something like that happening. The other component of that too, which this is more anecdotal, but just kind of when we were out there sampling that lower elevational band, it was relatively difficult to find adult whitebark pine, live adult whitebark pine, I should say, in that elevational band. There was lots of snags. So it's like whitebark pine clearly used to occupy that elevational band. They were much kind of fewer and farther between than the other species as far as live trees above 20 centimeters goes. So I guess all those things sort of lead me to believe that it is evidence of an elevational sort of distribution shift. But potentially there is some sort of competition aspect still happening in that zone.
Great. I think that like what you just mentioned really links with what Diana was referring to. I'm going to read hers now. That says, a lot of evidence that nutcrackers cache under closed canopy. Whitebark pine seedlings do not grow well under closed canopy. Do you think that these comments like relate to what you were mentioning?
Yeah. And so I think that interestingly, what we really saw is that I didn't actually show this, but there was this strong sort of negative association with the whitebark pine juveniles and Engelmann spruce overstory. And so I think these really wetter spots where there's larger Engelmann spruce and it's super shady, those are the places where we really almost saw no whitebark pine juveniles. As far as sort of the impact of I guess competition and then the sort of shade environment, we didn't see a super clear there was all this sort of nuance around the site conditions and the different pieces, and there wasn't this super clear if the total overstory density is above this threshold, then we don't see whitebark pine juveniles. We were seeing some even in relatively dense sort of overstory neighborhoods. So I don't think that doesn't contradict what we already know about the species and sort of the fact that it doesn't tend to do very well in the understory. But I think that kind of what we saw is that maybe that's not where we're seeing the most of it, but they still exist there. Like we're still finding them, but potentially in lower abundance.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Kara. She says, great work, Josh. Can you comment on the extent of which your findings from sites in the Bitterroots are applicable to other regions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something I've kind of been, as I'm sort of wrapping up this analysis, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think that, as far as general approach, I think there's definitely sort of a way to generalize these results. But I do think that, I don't know, one thing when I was going back to the literature and reading about sort of, I kind of mentioned this offhand in the introduction, but the topographic niche of whitebark pine and sort of like, okay, in some places it's like, yes, whitebark pine is really associated with these hot, dry, exposed, south-facing ridges. We don't see as much of it in these sort of like mesic kind of little drainages or concavities, things like that. But then there's sort of conflicting results in other mountain ranges within the distribution where it's like, oh no, maybe we actually see more of them on these sort of like northern facing slopes, but combined with other site characteristics. And so I don't know, I think that's something I'd like to investigate more in the future is like maybe trying to pin down sort of how the sort of fine scale topographic niche differs sort of from region to region. And hopefully that can sort of help pinpoint that maybe, yeah, like maybe planting on this aspect and this slope angle in one mountain range might not be the best place to plant, or carry out restoration activities in another mountain range. So I'm interested in trying to kind of like, yeah, learn more about the differences there.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Please reach out to us so we can advertise them when you get to a point. The next question is from Emily Farrell. It goes as one of your results was that warmer, drier sites at high elevations was better for regeneration. How much do you think this has to do with water availability and or heat stress or number of growing days?
Yeah, totally. I think that it's a combination of all those things. And I guess to also kind of bring in the competition component again, I think that kind of what we saw at our sites, right, is that like whitebark pine can outcompete all the co-occurring species on these like hot, dry, exposed ridge lines. It does pretty well in those environments, but then those are going to be some of the things that are going to face really extreme water stress at sort of the lower elevational range of the species. And so I think kind of all of these pieces are sort of working together that like at higher elevations where there's, greater snowpack, a little bit more moisture, that those exposed south-facing ridges sort of have this like ideal combination, I guess I should say, of these conditions for whitebark pine establishment. And so as the climate changes, kind of those positions at lower elevations, I think are going to experience a lot more water stress. And so there's going to be that piece. And then I guess, yeah, at higher elevations, right, it's that sort of trade-off between growing degree days and temperature and water stress. And so with shifting snowpack too, that's another potential kind of, I don't know, wrench in the machine of how this all works. But I think that, yeah, it seems like whitebark pine kind of prefer these sort of like areas where all those things line up for whitebark and fit with how whitebark pine is able to handle those conditions and not so much with its competing species.
Thank you so much, Josh. We still have a couple of questions and comments, but we won't have enough time to go over them. So I'll send them to you with the respective contact information. Including one of those is we received a couple of questions on where you found or if you could share the Mallerson 2007 article, the one that has the establishment filter figure and a few other ones. But just for keeping it within time, on behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, I want to thank you again for your participation. Our next webinar series will be on December 16, featuring Diana Tombach, professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, presenting on whitebark pine restoration, including plants, strategies, toolkits, and technology. Thanks again to all our attendants for attending, and stay tuned for upcoming installments. Thanks so much again, Josh.
Cool. Thanks, Enzo.